Now our demands, Mr. Chairman. This committee should be sensitive to the new imperialist intrigues in the months ahead. The rigged elections should be denounced in advance. Now our demands, Mr. Chairman. This committee should be sensitive to the new imperialist intrigues in the months ahead. The rigged elections should be denounced in advance because they have been rigged in advance. The United States Congress interference should be condemned. Sanctions should be intensified, and all members of the illegal regime, black and white, should be barred from entering any member state of the United Nations. As for the Patriotic Front, Mr. Chairman, we want to give your committee a pledge. We promise this committee that we will now go flat out to smash the Salisbury regime by escalating our armed struggle.
Welcome to this edition of Free Talk. This program brought to you in partnership with Frederick Newman Foundation. I'm your host, Dara Blessed Mhlanga. Now, this week we're going to be discussing the Patriot-Bill, a bill that government is going to introduce to try and control citizens' engagement with foreign governments. Now, the bill, among other things, asks the people of Zimbabwe not to engage with foreign governments in any manner whatsoever that is deemed negative, a negative portrayal of Zimbabwe. Now, many have said that this is in an effort to curtail or to instill patriotism in the first instance. Secondly, to curtail or deal with people who go out of the country looking for sanctions. Now we're going to go on the streets and we're going to be asking the question, do you think that this bill, the Patriotic Bill, is needed in a democratic space? Do you think that the introduction of this bill is a government that is fighting its own citizens? Is this necessary? Is it important at this particular time in Zimbabwe? Follow me to the streets and hear what the people have to say. This is Free Talk, proudly sponsored by Frederick Newman Foundation, FNF.
The pertinent question to ask is the government of Zimbabwe fighting its own people by proposing to have the Patriotic Bill? The answer is definitely yes. There is no rational or reasonable government that can regulate or legislate for love and affection for one's country. What the government of Zimbabwe must do is to make all efforts and establish policies and principles that make Zimbabweans happy and proud of their country. What the government of Zimbabwe must never do is to confuse the love for one's country and the support for the ruling party. Zimbabweans in general love and are very patriotic people. They love their country so much. But what they have is a serious disagreement with the government in terms of its policies, its human rights record, and the manner in which it has handled its business, including corruption, malpractices, and nepotism that has caused a lot of underdevelopment and disadvantages to a majority of Zimbabweans. The government of Zimbabwe must put all its effort towards national healing, nation building, and also uniting the people of Zimbabwe towards a common goal and a vision, and stop this unnecessary and unreasonable law. Zimbabweans do not need the Patriot-Bill. What Zimbabweans need is food at the table, and to corruption, and to nepotism, and to violence, and to election manipulation, and to vandalism of the constitution through unnecessary amendments and the respect of human rights.
Yeah. The government is fighting its own citizens. Why? Because isusu hatikwanise kuenda kumaembassy tichienda kunotaura kuti tinoda kudai nekudai nekudai, because ivo zvavaita izvi zvinhu zvekuti isusu hatikwanise kuenda ikoko. Saka ndichiona inini nenjiti it's fighting its own citizens.
Nyika yedu government yedu vanhu vanopatira kunogona kuti marights akuru nawo, asi cabinet yake vanobatira vanhu zvisingaite, vanobatira vanhu tiri marights edu, asi government inopedza yangu yakuzosuwa vanhu vacitizen muno havana marights ngekuti asi government inopedza yabata marights edu. Unogona kupinda kunze kwenyika woteverwa utsvagwa kuti iwe watengesa nyika uchitata zvakati.
No. They are not fighting, but kana paine mutemo unenge uripo wavanenge vataura zvine zvarambidzwa mugovernance whatso, I don't think kuti vanenge of course unogona kuita zvekuti zvikuabvisa vanhu kana kuita sechinhu zvekuti mumwe munhu anofanira ngozvitaura, but patechizvitaurira mani hazvibudi unless kana paine imwe right yekuti pane paunotanga waenda unotsanangurirwa manje unopiwa here kana ipepa kana chii chinokupa simba rekuti unokwanisa kuzonotaura outside somewhere nenyaya yezvinenge zvichiitwa zvakutadza vanhu vaitwa sei, nekuti mumba kamutemo yemumba haiexpose hedu.
No, it's not. It's not. That bill has to be amended. That is what I think. That bill has to be amended. Because we can't go out there and take help from other countries. We have to solve our own problems in here. That's my opinion.
Welcome to this edition of Free Talk. This program, which is brought to you by Heart and Soul TV and radio in partnership with Frederick Newman Foundation. Now, our partners, Frederick Newman Foundation, believe in building a society where there's free speech, just conversations between people of a nation, politically free dialogue and exchange of ideas. And this is how we bring you this program. Now, this week we are going to be discussing the contentious issue, something that has got everybody in Zimbabwe talking, the Patriot-Bill that is being tabled in Parliament by the government. Now, government has brought in this bill, which was first discussed in cabinet mid last year, where they are saying that they want to instill patriotism in the people of Zimbabwe. Chief among some of the issues around this bill is that, number one, it will not allow private citizens to engage with foreign governments. Only government officials will be allowed to do diplomacy on behalf of Zimbabwe. And they say that this has been put in place chiefly by people who have gone out of the country, political players, to call for sanctions. And they say that these sanctions are hurting Zimbabwe. Now, joining me for this conversation, I have one of the people who helped draft the constitution that brings in a number of important fundamental human rights, which many believe will be trampled on by the introduction of this patriotic bill. Alex Magaisa, most of you know him as the author of the Big Saturday read, an amazing read that many people have been following. Thank you, Dr. Magaisa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Blessed. Glad to be here.
Lovely. Now, I'm also joined by Blessing Vava. Now, Blessing Vava is a long member of the, a former member of the National Constitutional Assembly. He's an academic and now is a leader at Crisis Coalition. He's a member, an active member of the civil society, and has been a towering figure in terms of civil politics in Zimbabwe. Thank you, Blessing, for joining us.
Thank you, Blessed. Always my pleasure to share my ideas with the people of Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much. And we will be joined as we go into the program. We'll be joined by Namatai Kwekweza, an amazing young lady who is passionate about constitutionalism and civil liberties in Zimbabwe. Now, this program is brought to you by Frederick Newman Foundation, and we're here to answer the big question: is government fighting its own citizens by introducing this bill? Now, I will start with you, Dr. Magaisa, to just put this question in context. Is the government fighting its own citizens by introducing this bill?
Well, thank you very much, Blessed, for having me here and a blessing to discuss this, I think, very important topic concerning the so-called, I'm not sure whether it's called the Patriot-Bill or the Patriotic-Bill. I'm not so sure at the moment. And as you have pointed out, we don't yet have a bill, so we are merely discussing what has been discussed in Parliament and in the media, the representations that have come from Cabinet. I think what is important, Blessed, is to understand the rationale of this bill and the purpose and also the timing of the bill. Why has it become necessary to introduce such a law in Zimbabwe at this point in time? And of course, I think that later on in the program, perhaps sooner rather than later, we shall be discussing the parallels that have been drawn between this proposed law and other laws which are found in other countries. And I think once we get to that discussion, we will be able to understand the reason why this act is being introduced, its purpose, as an instrument which is designed to achieve certain political objectives. But maybe it is too early for me to delve into that issue for the moment. But I just wanted to point out, Blessed, that I'm thoroughly surprised by the fact that when Cabinet first introduced the issue of the Patriot-Bill last year, it pointed out that the proposal had come from the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, the NPRC, which, when we were drafting the Constitution, we created this organ as an important organ to promote peace and reconciliation. But for it to recommend, a law which traditionally is used as a political weapon by the ruling elite against opponents is truly astounding. And I've never heard the NPRC deny what the government said, which suggests that the idea that it recommended it is true, but I think it's a total abrogation of the NPRC's responsibilities. And I should also point out, Blessed, in closing this opening statement, that it should be surprising to many Zimbabweans that throughout the colonial regime, even the period that Ian Douglas Smith was in charge of Zimbabwe, a time when the nationalists were fighting for independence, were at the forefront calling for sanctions against Rhodesia, calling for embargoes against Rhodesia. Ian Douglas Smith never once decided that he was going to introduce a law imported from any other country in order to stop them from making those campaigns. Of course, there were rules which were punishing these people, but not importing a law such as what we are seeing at the moment. And so it's ironic that 41 years after independence, a Zimbabwean government wants to use what is a draconian piece of legislation which violates some of the most basic rights which are found in the Constitution.
Blessing, your view, is government fighting its own people by introducing this bill, or it's safeguarding the legacy of this nation?
Essentially, we have seen since the taking over of Emmerson Mnangagwa in November 2017 that there's been a systematic approach to further entrench dictatorship that we noticed during the Mugabe era. But of course, this is what happens when there is a military takeover of government, in that the constitution is no longer respected. It's a rule by decree. I'm sure you are aware of the number of statutory instruments that have been gazetted to date. Countless, as compared to the time that Robert Mugabe was in office. And it shows the government's appetite to thwart any opposing voices, any critical voices, anyone whom they deem that is unpatriotic. And in any sense, patriotism is not defined by ZANU-PF, but patriotism is something that is already entrenched, that is already well entrenched in our constitution. And what Zimbabwe needs right now are not laws like the Patriot-Bill, which is being proposed by ZANU-PF. But what we need is basically an entrenchment and a culture of inculcating the constitution and constitutionalism among Zimbabweans. But of course, we all know the flaws of the constitution-making process. I know Dr. Magaisa was one of the people that were very critical in coming up with this constitution. I'm sure in that they were very sincere, but the challenge is that ZANU-PF was not even sincere in the constitution-making process. That is why before even fully implementing the constitution, before even aligning the laws, the old laws to the current constitution, they are still bastardizing, they're still coming up with strange amendments to do away with all the gains, if I should say. Like some say that the incremental gains that were made in 2013. But well, we know that the government that we have is not a government that was a product of the people. Yes, it came through a military coup and also the contestations around the 2018 elections. But more importantly, we must go back to history, that this is another attempt, if I should say, of reintroducing the NGO bill that was rejected, I think, in 2004, which was essentially a replica of the 1967 PVO Act that was, promulgated by the government of the racist government of Ian Smith. So we can safely say that the government is at war with its own people, a government that has failed to provide the basics, a government that has failed to assist the economy, and a government that is always in panic, a government that is always looking for pieces of legislation to punish its own citizens. Patriotism is not something that can be instilled, but it's something that is already enshrined in the virtue of me being a Zimbabwean. Essentially means I'm a patriotic Zimbabwean. I'm sure Zimbabweans love their country, but they are made to hate a certain political party, certain leaders, because of misgovernance, because of corruption, because of the breakdown of the rule of law, etc., etc.
Yeah. Dr. Magaisa, can you just, from a legal point of view, just so that people understand what we are discussing, tell us what the Patriotic Bill entails, what it proposes to bring from the motion that has been put in the public domain.
Well, thanks, Blessed. It's an almost impossible task. The difficulty with the current situation is that we only know what ZANU-PF politicians are saying from what they have commented, in one of the motions, in one of the parliamentary debates, and the cabinet statement which came out last year, and then of course the various newspaper discussions as well as some social media discussions. So I think it's very difficult to say precisely what the law is going to entail. I mean, if we had a bill, then we would be able to go clause by clause and say this is what it says. So at the moment, it's a lot of vague information that is available. But as you pointed out in your introduction, one of the key points about the bill, or at least about the proposed law, is that it would prohibit people, private individuals, private citizens, from engaging with so-called foreign governments, engaging with foreign governments without the authority of the government. Now, it's very broad, it's very vague at the moment for us to make any, sense of it. I think that at some point, when the bill is actually drafted, if it does get drafted, you and I and Blessing and maybe others will come back and sit down and go through it clause by clause to try and interrogate the legality or even the constitutionality of the proposed clauses. I think at the moment what we are discussing really is the policy as pronounced in the discussions, and even that policy itself is also quite vague. To my mind, as Blessing said quite accurately, I have to point out that we are dealing with a regime that has come out of or that was born of a coup. It's a regime that is very much militaristic in its outlook, in its approach, very militaristic in its operations. And so it is not surprising. We have seen a number of arrests that have taken place in Zimbabwe, arrests of activists, arrests of political opponents, and all this, has really been a show of the authoritarian nature or the illiberal nature of the regime. And so it is not surprising that they are contemplating introducing a law which would not enhance the rights of the people, but would in fact negate further the rights that are already enshrined in the Constitution, including, for example, the right to free speech. So I think that it's difficult, Blessed, to discuss the legalities of the bill. I think what we can discuss, is the desirability or otherwise of the policy or the idea behind the bill. And of course, in that regard, we can also talk about the constitutional aspect of what is intended to be done. And in my opinion, it is not only something that would stretch the Constitution, but would violate a number of basic rights in the Constitution. At some point, as I said, when it comes to it, because I know that they are using a law of the United States of America as justification for bringing in this type of a bill, I would like you and I and others who are here to discuss, that bill in order for us, at least from my point of view, to demonstrate that the legal basis or even the constitutional idea behind using such a bill does not even exist, even from the American perspective or the American standpoint. And so at that point, I think we can have that discussion as to why it is not wise to bring that bill.
Yeah, the Americans do have what is called the Logan Act, and ZANU-PF and those who are behind the Patriot-Bill are using this as a parallel to say that we need this bill or we need the Patriotic Act to ensure that people do not go around demonizing their own country. Now, we just joined by Namatai Kwekweza. Namatai Kwekweza is the founder of We Lead, a vibrant organization of young women who are taking leadership stance in Zimbabwe. And she has been in the headlines talking about constitutionalism and talking about defending the Constitution. Now, welcome, Namatai. And maybe as we greet you, you can go into your opening remarks as to addressing the issue that we are facing today. Is government fighting its own citizens through the introduction of the Patriotic-Bill?
All right, so thanks very much, Blessing. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to speak with my camera turned off because my network is a bit unstable. So yeah, you have to see my picture and not my face. So yes, definitely. I just wanted to start from a place where I say that we are living in one of the most critical times in the history of our country. And in as much as a lot of people might try to look at the Patriotic-Bill alongside all these other bills that have been proposed at this particular moment in the history of our country, including the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2, you would actually realize that all of this is part of a deliberate a plot to consolidate power for one particular individual. And I think that it's very important that we do not just analyze this from the legal context, but also from the political context from which these bills are emanating from. We need to take cognizance of where these bills have emanated from, who is very active in driving them, what are the contents, basically speaking into the substantive nature of these bills, as well as the procedural aspects that are being carried out to have these bills put in place. So I want to just say that it's very important that we cannot alienate the bills themselves from the political context to which we're finding ourselves in. So now diving straight into the subject of the Patriotic-Bill. The first thing that we have to note is that the Patriotic-Bill is not one that is driving a nationalistic agenda, but rather one that is driving a political agenda that is basically to make certain that certain people who are perceived as political enemies of a particular party are somehow experience forms of impediment to being able to run for public office. They experience some sort of punishment because now it is being legislated that if they behave in a certain way, then they are going to actually get penalized and punished for that. So I'm sure that the speakers who came before me have done a great job at explicating the origins of this particular bill. And I think now it is very important for us to understand that in as much as we can talk about it from a legal context, to say that, oh, it's a bill, it's got its principles that are derived from the Logan Act, it's got all of that. The most important thing that we need to highlight is that this bill is targeted at the opposition, it's targeted at CSOs, and we cannot have a healthy and thriving democracy without a healthy opposition. We cannot have a healthy and thriving democracy without institutions that are watchdogs to the government and its behavior. And if this bill is going to be put into place, it's actually going to affect that balance of power. And this is why people have to be very active towards making sure that they defend democratic space. It's not just about some bill, it's about our democracy. And it's also about ensuring that we prevent the insurgence of a one-party state. So I think those would be my opening remarks with regards to the Patriotic-Bill. Thanks very much, Blessing.
Sure. Now, Vava, let me come to you, Vava, and say, some people have said that the civil society, and Namatai says that as well, that this bill is targeting the operations of the civil society. Because also, from my understanding from the cabinet paper that was released, the bill will seek to ensure that it becomes illegal for anyone to demonstrate where there is a regional or international summit and where a foreign head of state is visiting the country.
Sorry, Blessed, I lost you the first part of your question.
Okay, so I was saying that in this context, as Namatai has said, that this bill is aimed at fighting political parties and civil society. And some have argued that, especially when you look at what the cabinet has proposed, that there should be no demonstration where there's an international summit or a regional summit, or where a foreign head of state is visiting the country. Members of civil society or anyone else cannot demonstrate. It will be illegal to do so. How does this affect the work of civil society?
Of course, Blessed, it seriously affects the work of civil society, but we must look at this into the context of the prevailing situation in our country, and also going back to history. As I alluded earlier on, that this is some sort of a resuscitation of the NGO bill, which is mainly targeted at the civic society. That's why they are trying to craft it in such a way that you know, we are not allowed to demonstrate, etc., etc. But we have seen ever since the consummation of the new dispensation, if I should say, they want to call it the new dispensation, there's been a systematic approach by the Harare administration to entrench a one-party state system. We've seen what they've done to the MDC, taking over their offices, you know, all the confusion that is happening in the MDC, the arrests of activists. It's all a ploy and an attempt to muzzle the voices of the citizens. So it's also an attempt to further shrink the democratic space. Of course, some would argue that there was no democratic space to talk about, but that little that was there, the gains that some celebrated in 2013 when the constitution was, consummated, all those are being eroded, but they're being eroded by ZANU-PF, which is seeking to entrench a one-party state, system of governance. Secondly, to close the democratic space. So we're not surprised by, the idea of even thinking about the Patriot-Bill. But what does it tell us? It tells us of a government that essentially does not know its purpose. A government that knows its purpose should know that there are a lot of things that we should be focusing on: development, the resuscitation of the economy. Right now, we're fighting a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and Zimbabwe is only one of the few countries that didn't have a proper system, health mechanisms to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't even know even the people that were affected, the numbers of the people that died due to the pandemic, but also because of the dilapidation of the health delivery system, the education delivery system. All these form part of, social service delivery, which this government has consistently ignored, but focusing on power, entrenching dictatorship. As Namatai has said, that we must look at this in the political sense, that it's not just about demonstrations, but it is also an attempt to entrench a one-party state system. And Zimbabweans must be careful, and Zimbabweans must not think that this is just for us who are active in the civic society, or this is just for the opposition. But it is for every citizen to be worried. It is for every citizen to be very, very much worried and take an active stance against any attempt to muzzle our voices, any attempt to, to disturb the peace that is prevailing in that. Sorry.
But Vava, this bill seeks to stop engagements with foreign governments and demonstrations only where there are international summits. I mean, this can't be reduced to trying to have a one-party state, can it?
Blessed, you must, I want to take you back to the events of 2019. If you know the SADC summit that happened in 2019, may the soul of President Magufuli rest in peace. I was part of a delegation that went to Dar es Salaam to attend the SADC People's Summit. The SADC People's Summit is a convergence of civic society, social movements across Southern Africa. It happens concurrently to the SADC Summit. And what basically happens is that after the deliberations of the situation that are happening in our country, we submit a petition to the SADC Heads of State. But on that particular time, I was shocked to read a newspaper headline that I was part of people that were being trained in banditry. And I wondered where was that happening? But it was because we are attending, a SADC summit. And besides, we were also questioned by some security personnel in Tanzania that, you guys, you are here to humiliate President Mnangagwa. When we were nowhere near the summit, the SADC Heads of State, but we're only discussing the issues that are also affecting, citizens, but also mainly to do with social economic justice issues. So I can say that they are just trying to hide behind the cover. They're just identifying the demonstration that happened during that. How many times does heads of states visit our country, if we can count? But it's just a cover to make sure that they continue trampling on our rights, to make sure that they continue closing the democratic space, to make sure that their power, they go unchallenged, and to make sure that Zimbabwe becomes a one-party state. Look at all the things that have been happening since the coup. Mnangagwa came with the voice of the people is the voice of God. If you look at what is happening in Zimbabwe right now, certainly that's not the voice of God. We can see systematic approaches I've alluded earlier on, the militarization of the institutions of governance, the judiciary, the corruption that is happening, the arrests, the numbers of abductions, activists that have been charged with treason. We have never seen such levels of brutality, such levels of dictatorship, even during the time of Robert Mugabe.
Alex, let me come to you. The argument that even the best democracy in the world, the United States of America, has the Logan Act, and this protects the interests of the country. Can this argument hold?
Well, thank you again, Blessed. May I start first with the issue of patriotism? Once you have a government, once you have a state trying to define what patriotism means, and in this case where the state is totally controlled by a political party, which as Namatai and Blessing have stated, is intent on establishing a one-party regime, which is intent on controlling the opposition, then you have a problem, because patriotism then is defined in the terms that are set by the ruling party. It doesn't end there, Blessed. It also includes things like the teaching of history. If you ask students of history and students of politics, they will tell you that in the last 15, 20 years, there has been a lot of writing. I remember the late Professor Terence Ranger writing about, the issue of, patriotic history, and there are many scholars who wrote about this issue. ZANU-PF, trying to define the meaning of patriotism, and in doing so, also even wanting to influence scholarship and commissioning, academics and commentators to write a particular version of history that sort of celebrated ZANU-PF, celebrated President Mugabe, and excluded many other actors in that regard. I'm sure you have had a lot of people from, for example, the ZAPU side, the ZIPRA side of the liberation struggle, complaining how they've been excluded in that history of liberation. But that's just a part of it. I'm trying to give context. And this is inspired by what my two colleagues have already mentioned, that you don't look at the Patriot-Bill simply as a legal instrument. You need to understand the Patriot-Bill as a political instrument within the political context, because it is a political tool that is being designed, crafted with the opposition in mind. And so we go back, Blessed, to 1799. That's how far back we have to go, 2 centuries ago. That's when the United States of America introduced a law that is called the Logan Act. And it is called the Logan Act on account of a certain gentleman called George Logan, a doctor in America, who tried to intervene and do some diplomacy on behalf of the United States of America in relation to its dispute with France during that particular period. And this was obviously not taken in good light by the then government of the United States, President Adams, who then decided that it would be a good idea to have a law that would prevent private citizens from engaging in diplomacy, which might affect the interests of America. And so that's how old the law is. But here's the fascinating part, that law has never been used to prosecute anyone in America for the past 2 centuries. There were only twice, when it was invoked and tried to indict 2 individuals, but nothing came out of it. There could not be a prosecution. And so it's a law that exists on the statute books of America, and some legal scholars have actually concluded that this act has been nullified by non-use. There have been situations where some people have tried to use it to talk about it, or that someone has violated the Logan Act, but none. It's a law which gives a huge amount of power to the President of the United States of America or to the executive. But interestingly, they have never used it. They have not used it. They have tried their best to actually avoid using it, because it's not a law that can be justified in a modern democracy, and they all know it. So there are a number of reasons why that law, including, of course, the potential constitutional violations of that law in relation to the right to free speech, among other things. But, essentially, it would be procedurally very difficult to surmount the evidentiary burden of using that law. So, yes, that law was there, but it's an old law that really has no place in any modern democracy, and that is why it is not even used in America itself. My point, Blessing, is that there are so many bad things that happen even in the best of democracies. Some countries have the death penalty, for example, and other countries don't have the death penalty. You don't take the worst of other countries and say that you are adopting it simply because they have it. It doesn't work like that. And as I said, that law in America, when you go back to 1799, when it was enacted as a political instrument. And so when you look at Zimbabwe in 2021, post-independence, 41 years, the government saying that it wants to enact such a law, they're not doing it for anything other than to use it as a political tool. It has no place in a modern democracy.
But its proposal, like I asked Blessing, I asked Vava, the proposal is to deal with foreign governments. Now, a political party in Zimbabwe would honestly, surely want to engage with local citizens. Doesn't that make sense?
Well, Blessed, here is how things work. Individuals, they engage with people, local and foreign, regional, for any number of reasons. Go back to the period of the government of national unity, or even before that, when we were having serious problems in this country. There are times when it's necessary for private citizens to engage either foreign governments or even foreign regional organizations in order to be heard. Because if that does not happen, then they will be left to their fate with a regime that is absolutely no desire to consider their interests or even to listen to them. I know that because, I used to be in a position where we would engage with the government, but also engage with other external players. Then they would also engage with us in order to understand what exactly is happening in Zimbabwe and around Zimbabwe. For anyone to say that it will be illegal for a Zimbabwean who wants to be heard, whose story needs to be told, that they should not be talking to anybody without the authority of the government, I think that is absolutely absurd, because it simply limits. If you go back to all those countries, if you go back to America, think about it this way, Blessing. Let me just leave you with food for thought, even for my colleagues here. The Zimbabwean government right now wants its sanctions, the so-called sanctions, to be removed. And what it has done is that it has engaged lobbying firms, American firms for that matter. Those American firms are doing a job on behalf of the Zimbabwean government. They are engaging with a foreign government, which is probably, you might say, in a dispute with the American government. Technically, you might say that those people are violating the American law. The Zimbabwean regime does not see the irony that it wants to ban its own citizens from engaging with other people when it's quite happy to engage with foreign citizens in order to advance its foreign policy.
Amazing. Namatai, you said in your opening submissions that we should not just look at this legalistically. Now, I want us to look with you from a non-legal point of view. Why should a Zimbabwean care about this Patriotic Act? They will tell you they've never engaged with foreign governments. They have no interest. So they don't really care about whether you've got this Patriotic Bill or not.
The thing about this is that we need to understand that this bill emanated from the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, whom in their 2018 and 29 reports indicated the need for such a bill. This was later carried forth by the Minister of Information, Monica Mutsvangwa, and then later on we saw it being published in the Herald. And what we need to understand between that bill and what links it to the Commission on Peace and Reconciliation is the fact that sometimes when human rights violations have been reported, it actually goes in that particular direction. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that a bill like this could mean that if I was to tweet hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter, for instance, a hashtag that could potentially be seen internationally, it could be perceived as decampaigning the country and someone could get arrested for that. If different CSOs or groups are to go outside to indicate that maybe there are human rights violations which are actually happening here locally in this country, that could be seen as decampaigning. And yet we understand that Zimbabwe belongs to a body of nations and it is supposed to be accountable to this community of nations in the context of its domestic treatment of citizens. So therefore, this bill in itself creates shadows that actually allow people to be abused here locally, and you have absolutely nowhere to go. You can't share with your neighbors that this is something that's actually happening to us. And this is one of the reasons why Zimbabweans, civil society groups, and even people within the opposition must actually care, because we understand that this bill seeks to alienate us. It seeks to monopolize the channels through which the international community is engaged, through only the channels that have been approved by the government. And in the context of accountability, particularly in the context of accountability of the citizens of this country, you would realize that that is not a feasible system to work under. Therefore, we need to liberalize communication, especially with the external world. And the final thing I wanted to say is that there is also the conversation around decampaigning. In this particular bill, decampaigning is a very, very broad term. It's not been well defined. Decampaigning could mean anything from a hashtag. It could mean a meeting with an ambassador. Maybe you never even said anything bad. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that it leaves a lot of opportunities for predatory judicial processes in which maybe an opposition member or a person from the civil society whom the government already does not like is seen having a meeting with a particular embassy, is seen talking to those people about this or that. And that in itself is going to be termed decampaigning, because the definition of decampaigning in this context is not specific and it's extremely broad. So I want citizens to understand that they should care, because there is a potential that this bill could be weaponized against those naturally who are going to interact with the international community. That's one. And particularly on citizens themselves, because if your rights are violated, pretty much you're going to go to the Commission on Peace and Reconciliation, which has proposed this bill. You're going to have to go to the same government, which is probably abusing your rights. So we need to have critical conversations around liberalizing conversations with the international community, because Zimbabwe is not an island. It is not an isolated country. It belongs to a body of nations, and it must be accountable to that body of nations in the context of its internal and domestic treatment of citizens. So that's why people should care.
Some people have argued that interacting with foreign governments is like, for instance, when you are seeking asylum with any other country, you'll be interacting with a government that is not Zimbabwean government. And could that then also mean that you're decampaigning your country?
That in that context of decampaigning, it could possibly mean that you are decampaigning, and there would be reasonable premise upon which that in itself can be an act of criminality. I say this in the context of, like I said before, the definition of decampaigning is extremely broad, as it were. And for you to go to another country and seek asylum, in essence, what you're saying is to say, well, where I'm coming from, it's very uncomfortable. Where I'm coming from, things are pretty bad. And that is what they're saying is decampaigning the country, pretty much. So I think that people have to understand that you will be left with literally nowhere to go, because whatever you're going to do, any kind of engagement that has not been approved by the government is going to be perceived as decampaigning. And believe me, I don't believe that this particular law, if it was to actually be effected, would actually be a law that would be used objectively. It is a law that would be used politically, which means that it is going to be targeting people that they do not like, or people that they perceive as political opponents or political threats. So I think that, especially if you're a citizen who is very active in politics, who is very politically conscious, and particularly active in things that have something to do with activism, you'd actually see that this bill would naturally target you the most, more than ordinary Zimbabweans. But yes, naturally, if asylum means going to another country and saying we are being, harassed, or this is happening to us, that will be an act of criminality under the Patriot-Bill.
Blessing, let me come to you. We have seen in the past, like during the last election, people like Nelson Chamisa, Tendai Biti, they went out of the country. They went to Britain, they went to other countries where they're basically talking to governments there and campaigning and sending out their message. And at one point, they were accused for actually calling sanctions when Tendai Biti appeared before the United States Senate. Now, is it desirable to have opposition leaders going out of their country and engaging with foreign governments?
Remember that Zimbabwe is a signatory to various international statutes on human rights, etc. And it is incumbent upon every citizen, civic society, but citizens' consent, to continuously monitor the government of Zimbabwe, its operations, to these statutes, while also updating the international community on the violations that are happening in the country. I know for a fact that the incident that you are referring to, remember that Zimbabweans, we have a lot of diaspora community that is outside. I'm not sure if indeed they had gone there in the process of the aim of demonizing the government of Zimbabwe. Well, that much I don't know. But what I know and what I think that should happen is that citizens are allowed, the Constitution allows for us to express ourselves. Free expression is enshrined in the Constitution. And the fact that Zimbabwe is signatory to those international human rights statutes, it is then incumbent upon ourselves, it's then incumbent upon even the civic society to continuously monitor the performance of our government if it is conforming to these international statutes. When we realize that they are not conforming to those, surely it's our right again to lobby the United Nations, to approach SADC, and to approach the African Union and various, and many of these other bodies where Zimbabwe is signatory to these statutes.
Mm-hmm. Alex, the government has been talking about sanctions. One of the major reasons of this patriotic bill is to ensure that people don't call for sanctions. Now, does this bill help in this this desire to ensure that sanctions don't come to the country?
Well, Blessed, when you are trying to solve a problem, you have to do a proper diagnosis, and you have to identify the source of the problem, and then you deal with that source of the problem. You don't add to the source of the problem. The Patriotic Bill is only going to further damage the reputation of the country. There is no modern parliament which will sit down and deliberate on a bill such as that in order for it to be passed. Not in this day and age, unless, of course, it is an authoritarian regime. So the only thing that the Patriotic Bill achieves is to further cement the reputation of the Zimbabwean regime as an authoritarian regime which is intolerant and which is caught up, in a very, very old era. So it doesn't help at all. The issue of sanctions that have been slapped on the various individuals and entities in Zimbabwe by the American government and others. This is an issue that needs to be tackled in a holistic manner, understanding what needs to be done. The Zimbabwe, as I pointed out earlier, is using American lobbying firms paying huge amounts of money, millions of dollars, for those governments to do precisely what it is wanting to prevent Zimbabwean opposition and activists from doing, which is to engage other actors which might be able to help in resolving the Zimbabwean issue. You know, we should not pretend, and unfortunately sometimes we tend to pretend that Zimbabwe is operating as a normal state, that things are normal, that the normal rules apply. The very reason that is causing people to go out there to cry out and ask to be heard by foreigners. You know, if you are a father or a mother, you know, if you are a parent and your children are going out to the next door neighbors to ask for help, you must ask yourself what the problem is, because the problem surely is not the children. If you treat your children well, if you look after your family well, your family will know that you are the father, that you are the mother, and they will look after you. They will come to you for any assistance. If they are going outside, there is something that is lacking in that house. It's probably that you are not providing enough, or you are probably being very abusive. And in my opinion, the Zimbabwean government simply needs to look into the mirror, look at what's happening, and try and solve the problems that are causing people to go out there. Zimbabweans don't have the power, they don't have the right to ask anybody or to cause anybody to impose sanctions on the country. Those are decisions that are made by mature men and women in those countries, individuals who have full capacity to consider and to see for themselves whether it's in the best interest of those countries to impose those sanctions. That is not up to Zimbabweans to do. And so for me, it's an incredible waste of time. It's a political weapon that is being created. It's a political gamesmanship which does nothing to help the cause of Zimbabwe, but only further damages the reputation of the country. And that's a pity.
I'll ask those in our audience who want to ask questions or to proffer their own comments to, as I open the floor. We are discussing here, is government turning against its own citizens by introducing this patriotic bill? Is our government at war with its citizens? Now, Dr. Magai, there seems to be an issue between loving one's country and loving one's government. Can you give us a distinction there, if there is? And I'll ask Professor Shepard Mpofu to come through with his contribution whilst you answer this.
Well, I think that it's a given blessing. It is something that is so obvious that it does not need to be repeated, that the government of the day and the country are two different entities. The government of the day is comprised of individuals who have been given authority, or in some cases who have taken authority in order to rule over others. There are a set of people who are fallible. They have got their weaknesses, they've got their foibles, they fail, and therefore it is possible for them to be challenged. It is possible for them to be disliked, to be despised, and that is why people have the right to choose their leaders every 5 years, in some countries every 4 years. So of course, you can despise, you can dislike your government, but you will still love your country because your country is bigger than the government. And I think that the unfortunate thing is that the Zimbabwean government, the ZANU-PF government in particular, the ZANU-PF establishment, has never seen itself as anything different from the country, from the state. It has always conflated the party and the state. For them, they are the state, and the state is ZANU-PF. And that failure to separate the two is the problem, because it seems to give them, or at least in their minds, it gives them the right, the power to define what is patriotic and unpatriotic. This has roots, of course, from the Liberation War period, where you could distinguish between a sellout and someone who is being patriotic. But remember that these very same people, during the liberation struggle, when they were fighting for independence, when they were fighting repression, when they were fighting an autocracy, they also went out. There are lots of videos, and I hope you will play a video clip of the late HStvZim, where he was talking about campaigning and calling for sanctions against Rhodesia as a legitimate weapon of fighting against the autocracy and repression that was taking place at the time. Just to show you that, these are legitimate methods that are used in order to fight repression in particular circumstances. Of course, it doesn't suit ZANU-PF because it is the one in power, but if it were out of power and if it were under conditions of repression that it is causing to the people of Zimbabwe today, it would probably be justifying use of similar methods, just like it did in the 1970s. So it's not because they did not love Zimbabwe when they were calling out for sanctions, then they loved Zimbabwe, but they did not like the government of the day. It is the same thing today.
You can love your country and not love your government. Professor Mpofu?
Okay, thanks, Blessed. And I'd like to greet the presenters. And also, I agree with what your guests have said. But the problem that I noticed with the Zimbabwean situation is there's a conflation of the country with the ruling ZANU-PF. And there's also a conflation of the government of the day with the ruling party of the day. If you look in other countries where you respect even the opposition to an extent that the ruling parties don't interfere with the opposition, and the opposition, when they're in parliament, they actually work for the good of the nation, and there's progress in that. And if you notice what Themba Mliswa said, he actually said he doesn't want to spend time debating such useless laws. He said something to an effect that he's actually embarrassed that the parliament is to discuss such a kind of an initiative in the Patriot-Bill. So when you look at some of our, especially some of us who come from a family where there are lots of liberation war fighters and the like, who after the war never even believed in ZANU-PF's ideologies and never supported ZANU-PF for that matter, then you begin to question, were they in love with the country or were they in love with the ruling party? Or after independence, were they supposed to join ZANU-PF because there's a conflation of loving the country and loving the ruling party? Those are two totally different things. It is because of the love of the country that somebody who feels that they're not listened within the country when the human rights abuses, they have to go out in order to get allies and support, in order to free and to give the people at home freedom. And if you look at the Zimbabwean diaspora, for instance, you might find that some people are yearning to go back home. They're not living comfortable lives outside the country where they are. And they are going to petition the governments where they exist or where they are living, so that they can actually knock sense, as it were, into ZANU-PF said, so that the ruling party can actually create a state where citizens can exist in peace and in harmony and have their human rights respected. And therefore, such an engagement is not selling out. It's actually looking for the good of the larger majority of the people, or the larger majority of the family members. So I believe, I for one, and as the guests have said here, that one, you cannot legislate patriotism. You cannot legislate love for the country. That affinity for one's country should be a given. Actually, the love for the country is a given because we are born there. If you listen to the stories that we tell about our villages, about our old men, about family patriarchs and matriarchs, everyone identifies with that. When we wax lyrical about our older days, that love for our communities and love for our societies actually comes out. But again, lastly, what largely informs ZANU-PF's behavior is that they've been allowed to get away with murder for a long time. Let's look at the issue of the heroes, how they install national heroes, for instance. A national hero is somebody who has set an example and they serve the nation in various capacities. But if you look at how Mugabe installed national heroes and how ZANU-PF has installed national heroes for a long time and bearing them at the National Heroes Act, they're to subscribe to ZANU-PF ideologies. they have to have belonged to ZANU-PF and never left ZANU-PF at some point. And if they did any of these, therefore they are used as ZANU-PF to woo or to sort of buy out the love of the people that support those particular people. If you look at Edgar Tekere, for instance, by the time he died, there were strained relations, but he was forcibly buried at the Heroes Act. But some heroes of their own standing, is it Stembiso Nyoni? Is it Nyoni or less? Yeah, she was a hero by her own right, but she couldn't be recognized as such by merely having left the ruling party. And therefore, the fact that ZANU-PF has actually been led or has actually gotten an impression that they can install national heroes, they can determine what a national hero, a national symbol is, actually gives them the impetus and the push to actually say we can actually determine what patriotism should look like, what patriotism should taste like, what patriotism should sound like, which I think is largely out of the way. And some of the citizens who are outside the country will definitely continue to engage with foreign governments without the fear of this law. They can intimidate citizens so much, but I believe that some people are based outside the country already have contacts or already have respect by the foreign governments to an extent that for a foreign government to make an intervention, they have to consult certain Zimbabwean experts, and those will be truthful to the love of the nation and not love of the country, to give proper guidance to foreign governments who want to intervene or want to help or assist in the Zimbabwean cause.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I see you would know more about patriotism by the jersey that you are wearing there.
Well, yesterday were the greatest of comebacks, so ZANU-PF can install this law, but Zimbabweans will have the greatest of comebacks at the end.
So thank you very much. You know, you, myself, and Musaigwa, they share the passion for Arsenal. I'll come to you, Shingi, for your contribution then to the Nyika Mugari before I ask my panelists to give me closing remarks. Shingi, if you are not there, maybe Nyika Mugari.
Yes. Good evening, gentlemen, colleagues, gentlemen and ladies.
Yes.
It's really fantastic. It's unfortunate that I am just hooking onto this platform. I think you noticed. And I have no clue whatsoever, but indeed, I think this is a very interesting conversation that is going on in light of the threat of legislation, like colleagues are saying, that people are going to be, you are going to come up with a law that tries to enforce patriotism. I think it's a feeling, it's something that, you know, attachment to your country, attachment to your fellow citizens does not have to be imposed or forced on a person. It comes naturally out of appreciation of a sense of belonging. Who doesn't want to belong somewhere? I think it would be a very interesting kind of personality who is not themselves naturally moved by a sense of wanting to be part of a community. And if you are part of Zimbabwe, whether you are in diaspora or wherever, the fact that you were born there naturally places you there as home. That becomes home for you, for the better or for the worse. And that attachment will not stop pushing people to take any actions or moves that blesses home, that translate into some form of a better future for your country. I'll give you an example. I will cite the examples of our predecessors, those in ZANU today and elsewhere too, not just in ZANU alone. It was not just ZANU alone that fought the war to liberate this country. Those people went out to take up arms, remember? They went up to negotiate for something that probably people are not negotiating for today. They went to talk to Russian governments, to the Chinese government, to Tanzania, to other fellow African governments to ask for arms to come and wage a war, not because they hated home. They did not foist war on this country during that time because they were motivated by a hate, a self-hate or hatred for mother country. It was precisely for the greater good. And we still appreciate them today for that contribution. And I don't think that the process of wishing for the best for your country ends with some generation. They have no monopoly over wanting to do the best for this country, over wishing for the best for this country. Yes, things may go haywire, things may go not as planned, but I suspect that people who are out there who have left this country, whether it is because of economic pressures and so on, and if we should be refusing the little cash that they send home to support their families back, if indeed they were not patriotic. If we accept some of their gestures, I mean, how can we then begin to say now you are no longer patriotic because you are being critical of certain policies that are there on the ground? So I am really with you guys to say the idea of legislating patriotism, well, I think it's a very novel idea that is being thought of by our colleagues in Parliament. I don't know what it is that they are pushing for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very important. In fact, the diaspora remittances are not even little because they are actually the second largest foreign currency earner in this country. You know, so it is just amazing how much they are giving to this country. I'll ask Gadzaweta maybe just for his just short contribution. Then we will go to my panelists.
My short contribution goes to question the idea of omitting citizen participation, especially in policy in Zimbabwe. Because my understanding is that Zimbabweans are the ones who voted for the constitution. But then if Zimbabweans have not complained and demanded another law that should be enacted, I think it's invalid and it's even useless to concentrate on a new bill because it's not about the people. People should have queried or demanded that we need a patriotic bill, so to say. So the parliament, because we give parliament powers to represent us. So if they end up representing selfish means and personal interests, or end up trying to thwart people's views through legislations that they pass in parliament, it means they are betraying the will of the people. I think in Zimbabwe, what needs to be done is to normalize citizen participation and evidence-based policy response. Because we are talking of policies that have got long-term effects on Zimbabweans. And by far, I regard Zimbabweans as more patriotic than even the people in government. Because the people who are sustaining the economy are the general Zimbabweans who are not even employed elsewhere, but who are doing errands elsewhere to sustain the government, of which their earnings are being looted by the people in government. So I think there's a misconception that complaining or airing grievances means that you are against a government or means that you are not supporting the government of the day, which is false in nature. What the government should do is to listen to the grievances that the people have and address them, not to try and thwart them by enacting laws that cripples people's voices. Because if anything in Zimbabwe, if you complain in Zimbabwe, it means you are sponsored. this comes to the issue of foreign people, foreign hand in any incident that happen in this country. But people have got genuine grievances. A lot is happening in this country. For example, the schools are open. Teachers are not willing to go to work. If people complain, it doesn't mean that they don't like the government. They just want the government to make sure that the economy is functional, or the social and political and economic fabric is functional. So the government has to lend an ear. If you look at our constitution, since 2013, we have had so many amendments. We have had so many bills being proposed, but then we have the parliament has got the task of aligning those laws. So it means somehow, they are getting it wrong. They need to concentrate on the important things that people demanded in the constitution. One which is of aligning the laws, which has not been done thoroughly. So I think the government has a long way to go insofar as citizen participation and evidence-based policy is concerned.
Thank you very much, Silence, for that contribution. Now, I'll come to you, Namatai. Namatai, you have been arrested. You have been, you still, I'm sure you still have reporting conditions. Every other time you've got to go and report to the police over issues, over your offense or your criminal, your alleged crime is that you protested against the tampering of the constitution, but you remain in Zimbabwe and you remain fighting for a constitutional order that is just. Now, in your concluding remarks, address the people of Zimbabwe from your heart to the people, and then the last part of it, address your government.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thanks so much, Blessing. I think I just want to appreciate the contributions that have been given by the people who were discussing aspects around patriotism, and also just generally the response that has been given by the people of this country. I think maybe as just my last remarks, I think it's also important that we don't get derailed. The Patriotic Bill is very, very important to talk about, but I also feel like at the moment our attention should gravitate more towards the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2, which is already in its second reading. As it were, the Patriotic Bill has not already been tabled in Parliament, so we don't actually have a bill. But it's been discussed that there is need for such a bill, henceforth the debate that took place on the 2nd of March 2021. So my fear is that if we are not careful, we could be derailed, and then maybe we stop focusing on the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2 and we focus on the Patriotic Bill, and then maybe the bill never actually comes. But the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2 has already been driven forward, has already been advanced to its third reading, until it gets to presidential assent. So I think that it's very important for us to strike a balance between those two bills, and also because the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2 is actually more critical, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and every other law in this country finds its validity and full effect and force through the Constitution. So as long as the Constitution is healthy, then we can be rest assured that any other law that is going to oppress the people of this country, we can actually fight it using the Constitution. That having been said, I just wanted maybe to just talk to people about what they can actually do in the context of resisting the Patriotic Bill and the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2. I think it's very important that people stop thinking that CSOs or like activists or movements, etc., are the ones who are going to be focusing on these things. This is a national thing. The Constitution is about everyone. If you look at the Constitution making process of 2013, it was a process that had 3.3 million people, with 94.4% of people voting yes to the Constitution being adopted as it is today. So it's not up to like a few Namatais, a few Wongais, a few Yangasod Matetes, a few Prince Goras, a few organizations like Veritas, Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, resisting the Patriot Bill and the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2. Zimbabweans in the diaspora, Zimbabweans here locally, must actually begin to organize themselves. And how do they do this? Number one, they need to find copies of these bills or information about these bills that they can find either online from reputable sources, sources like Veritas, like the Parliament of Zimbabwe, like Kubatana, which are the ones, Wilsa. They've been producing a lot of data and a lot of material around this. And when they have found this information, they also need to get legal interpretation. And when they've gotten legal interpretation, they also need to have a localized interpretation of these bills. When they have localized interpretation of these bills, the next thing that the people of this country need to do is to start organizing. For instance, have community outreaches, have meetings that they have, like what we are doing right now. Make use of social media campaigns, make use of online protests, and even some peaceful physical protest with regards to defending the Constitution. It's also very important to make use of petitions. It's important to write letters and to consistently be showing that the bulk and the majority of people are saying no to these unruly processes that are exclusionary in nature and seek to destabilize this country through affecting the already broken down democracy that exists in Zimbabwe. So I think we need to do all of those things as citizens and not auction the struggle or like give it away to a few individuals. Everyone has a responsibility and we should all organize in our different contexts. Then the final thing I just wanted to say with regards to particularly the government is just to say we see you, we see what you're doing, we see what you're trying to do, and there are people who are not going to back down without a fight. You will be met with resistance because for some of us, we are very passionate about defending the final remaining democratic space in this country. It is not okay to amend the constitution of this country with as minimum public input as possible, using exclusionary tactics in the midst of a global health pandemic where people couldn't even participate. It is not okay for the constitution of this country, which was by the consent of 3.3 million Zimbabweans who participated in the constitution making process in 2013, for that constitution to be tampered with, and to think that laws have not been aligned, to think that the constitution has not been fully implemented, and yet we're already tampering with that constitution. It is not okay. And with regards to the Patriot-Bill, I just wanted to say to my government, please don't embarrass yourself. It's just best to put that thing away because it's going to actually make you look bad. And yet what you wanted out of this was actually to create a good reputation. If you want to have a good reputation, stop abusing human rights. Reforms, please, they are way overdue. And the most important thing is to always remember that you can't legislate patriotism. If you give people what they want, the basic social economic things that they are supposed to have, because in any case, they are already rights. If you make sure that they have that, then naturally, they are also going to be proud of their government in as much as they are proud of their country. So please don't try to force us into being patriotic. We are allowed to choose the parties that we want to subscribe to. We are also allowed to engage with the international community when we feel like. So I think those would be my final responses. Thanks very much, Blessing.
Thank you. We see you. We see you. Vava, in your closing remarks, I know you lead Crisis Coalition, a very critical civil society movement in Zimbabwe. Now, what should people of Zimbabwe expect from Crisis Coalition in regards to this patriotic bill? And what is your message to government?
I think that the government of Zimbabwe must stop introducing these obnoxious bills at the expense of service delivery, at the expense of improving the economy, at the expense of improving the livelihoods of the people out there, because Zimbabweans are yearning for change, Zimbabweans are yearning for good governance, Zimbabweans are yearning to have food on their tables. But when our government is preoccupied in coming up with these bills, surely it's not doing us a favor. But also, what this is showing us in rounding up is that we need to be vigilant as citizens. More importantly, I think Zimbabweans need political education. We have made blunders before. The biggest blunder that we did, firstly, was supporting a politically driven or political party's constitution making process. This is why we are having this problem that we relegated the constitution making process to political parties. And these are the results that we are now suffering for. Secondly, we also supported a military coup of November 2017, which we thought that it was going to bring change. Change that we have not worked for, change that is coming through a gun, is not change that is not going to improve our livelihoods, it's not change that is going to improve good governance, it's not change that is going to respect our human rights. But in a nutshell, I would say us at the Crisis Zimbabwe Coalition, we have a series of activities that we are doing. More importantly, civic education around constitutional issues. Secondly, also engaging various stakeholders in making sure that we conform to the democratic tenets. And thirdly, we are calling for an entrenchment of constitutionalism and also the full implementation of the Constitution. The government must stop coming up with statutory instruments. They must stop establishing a one-party state and make sure that Zimbabweans have a government they want, a government they love, not a government that forces itself on the people, not a government that introduces laws like this one. But more importantly, ahead of 2023, I think Zimbabwe needs reforms. We need the harmonization of the Electoral Act and regulations well ahead of the elections that are coming in 2023, because without any critical reforms, without any meaningful reforms, we are going back in circles. We will still be having this kind of debates because the conditions of having those elections won't be democratic. The conditions of having the elections in the future will not enable Zimbabweans to participate freely, and will certainly entrench, like we said before, a one-party state which is detrimental to democracy, detrimental to good governance, detrimental to the modern tenets of democratic governance. So in those words, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vava. Now, Alex, I come to you. You were instrumental in the coming up with the Constitution, as you were in the COPAC team. You were one of the drafters of the Constitution. Now, in your closing remarks, can you address what this bill does to the gains of the Constitution making process, and what it also does to the Zimbabwean image internationally, and your advice to both the people of Zimbabwe and government as to the consequences and the effect if this bill does come to become an act?
Well, thank you, Blessed, for the opportunity that you offered us to discuss this important topic. I think important because it has been brought upon us by the government. Otherwise, on its own, it's pointless. We should not really be spending time discussing whether or not Zimbabwe should be adopting a bill or a law such as the Patriotic Law. The country is going through incredible difficulties, social, economic, and political challenges. People are facing dire poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic is wreaking havoc in our communities. The millions of young Zimbabweans are jobless and hopeless. These are the issues that should be concerning us. These are the issues that should be taking our attention, not discussing whether Zimbabwe should be, going back to what America did in 1799, 2 centuries ago, long before our own, ancestors were even colonized, long before we even fought for our own freedom. So it's really pointless, and I think that this regime, like many authoritarian regimes, they are very adept at creating sideshows, which attract people's attention, which detract us, from focusing on the core issues that should really be concerning us. And I endorse the message that was made by Namatai when she talked about the many other big issues that we should be concerning with in regard to the amendment to the Constitution, which they're trying to do. The Constitution is not perfect, but you know what? It's better to try to implement what is there, and it's less than 10 years. There is no point in trying to change it either by changing it directly, as they are trying to do with the Amendment number 2 bill, or doing so indirectly, as they are trying to do with the Patriotic Bill. I think that the Patriotic Bill will cause a lot of damage to the image of the country. It will only increase the view that the Zimbabwean regime is an authoritarian regime, an anti-democratic regime, a regime which is intent upon silencing and controlling the opposition, a regime which is not interested in opening up democratic space, contrary to the claims and the promises that were made, when these people came into power. I think that this point has been mentioned and it can't be emphasized enough. Patriotism cannot be legislated. I should add, blessed, that freedom is at the center of what a nation aspires to have. If the government were enacting a freedom law, a law which grants more freedom to the people of Zimbabwe, which is indeed what the Constitution itself requires, that there should be an incremental process to the realization of human rights, not having a bill which actually takes away from the existing rights, including the right to free speech. The Patriotic Bill is a political weapon, blessed. There is no doubt about it. It was a political weapon when it was enacted in America 2 centuries ago. It is a political weapon when the Zimbabwean regime wants to implement it now. A political weapon against opponents, against political activists, against civil society activists. It's a bill against freedom. It is ironic that they want to use a law which is 200 years old in one of the biggest democracies in the world, a law which is not even used, it is not even enforced there, because it is practically impossible to enforce it. It is a law that would never be passed by a modern US Congress. And it doesn't make sense for the Zimbabwean regime, which purports to be there for the people, a regime which was, you could say, a government which is a result of an independence process, which comes out and now starts to take away freedoms from the people. It is an undemocratic piece of legislation. It is a violation of fundamental rights and freedoms. It is, I would say, about 15 years ago, when the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act was introduced in the Zimbabwean parliament, I remember a memorable statement which was made by then one of the senior members of ZANU-PF, Edison Zobo, who was reporting as part of the Parliamentary Legal Committee. He described it as a very dangerous and a serious assault on democracy. I would say that even that would be an understatement in relation to the Patriotic Bill, or the idea behind this proposed law. It would be a serious, and I would even imagine a fatal assault on whatever little democracy that we have at the moment in Zimbabwe, the little democratic space that we have. It will be completely wiped out. But this is what this regime wants. This regime is not looking at increasing any democratic space. It is looking to reduce, to eliminate the democratic space. And I fully endorse the message which was made by Namatai, Blessing, and others, that there has to be a concerted effort among Zimbabweans to resist this. In fact, if you are a ZANU-PF and you are supporting this bill, then you need your head examined, because as you have seen over the past few years, it takes very little for someone to be taken out of ZANU-PF and you will be the target of that very law. So any Zimbabwean, any right-thinking Zimbabwean should really be fighting for defending the freedom that they have. And the Patriotic Bill is a fundamental, and I would add fatal, assault on democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex Magayisa, for joining us on this program. And thank you very much to all my panelists, Namatai Kwekweza and Blessing Vava, for this amazing discussion. Now, this discussion was brought to you by Heart and Soul TV and Radio in partnership with Frederick Newman Foundation on this, your program, Free Talk. Now, we believe free speech is the glue that brings social development and allows nations to thrive. In fact, where there is a free speech, there is more development. And where there is free speech, hardly do you need such things as patriotic bills. Now, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much for everyone for joining me. And till next time, I am yours, Blessed Mhlanga, your host, Dara B, here on Heart and Soul TV and Radio. This is Free Talk in partnership with Frederick Newman Foundation, our partners in free speech. Free speech is the center of development of any nation.
Musiki,